Verses 29 to 35. They laid hands on some of Paul's companions, and hurried them into the theater. v. 29. Some think with design there to make them fight with beasts, as Paul had sometimes done, or perhaps they intended only to abuse them, and to make them a spectacle to the crowd. Those whom they seized were Gaius and Aristarchus, of both of whom we read elsewhere. Gaius was of Derbe. Aristarchus is also there spoken of, and Colonel 410. They came with Paul from Macedonia, and this was their only crime, that they were Paul's companions in travel, both in services and sufferings. Paul, who had escaped being seized by them, when he perceived his friends in distress for his sake, would have entered in unto the people, to sacrifice himself, if there were no other remedy, rather than his friends should suffer upon his account, and it was an evidence of a generous spirit, and that he loved his neighbor as himself. He was persuaded from it by the kindness of his friends, who overruled him. The disciples suffered him not, for it better became him to offer it than it would have become them to suffer it. They had reason to say to Paul, as David's servants did to him, when he was for exposing himself in a piece of public service, "Thou art worth 10,000 of us." Others of his friends interposed, to prevent his throwing himself thus into the mouth of danger. They would treat him much worse than Gaius and Aristarchus, looking upon him as the ringleader of the party, and therefore better let them bear the brunt of the storm than that he should venture into it. v. 31. They were certain of the chief of Asia, the princes of Asia Asiarchae. The critics tell us they were the chief of their priests, or, as others, the chief of their players. Whether they were converts to the Christian faith, and some such there were even of their priests and governors, or whether they were only well-wishers to Paul, as an ingenuous good man, we are not told, only that they were Paul's friends. Dr. Lightfoot suggests that they kept up a respect and kindness for him ever since he fought with beasts in their theater, and were afraid he should be abused so again. Note, it is a friendly part to take more care of the lives and comforts of good men than they do themselves. It would be a very hazardous adventure for Paul to go into the theater. It was 1,000 to 1 that it would cost him his life, and therefore Paul was overruled by his friends to obey the law of self-preservation, and has taught us to keep out of the way of danger as long as we can without going out of the way of duty. We may be called to lay down our lives, but not to throw away our lives. It would better become Paul to venture into a synagogue than into a theater. The mob was in a perfect confusion. v. 32. Some cried one thing and some another, according as their fancies and passions, and perhaps the reports they received, led them. Some cried, "Down with the Jews," others, "Down with Paul," but the assembly was confused, as not understanding one another's minds. They contradicted one another, and were ready to fly in one another's faces for it, but they did not understand their own, for the truth was the greater part knew not wherefore they had come together. They knew not what began the riot, nor who, much less what business they had there, but, upon such occasions, the greatest part come only to inquire what the matter is. They follow the cry, follow the crowd, increase like a snowball, and where there are many there will be more. The Jews would have interested themselves in this tumult. In other places they had been the first movers of such riots, but now at Ephesus they had not interest enough to raise the mob, and yet, when it was raised, they had ill will enough to set in with it. v. 35. They drew Alexander out of the multitude, called him out to speak on the behalf of the Jews against Paul and his companions. You have heard what Demetrius and the silversmiths have to say against them, as enemies to their religion. Give us leave now to tell you what we have to say against him as an enemy to our religion. The Jews put him forward to do this, encouraged him, and told him they would stand by him and second him, and this they looked upon as necessary in their own defense, and therefore what he designed to say is called his apologizing to the people, not for himself in particular, but for the Jews in general, whom the worshippers of Diana looked upon to be as much their enemies as Paul was. Now they would have them know that they were as much Paul's enemies as they were, and those who are thus careful to distinguish themselves from the servants of Christ now, and are afraid of being taken for them, shall have their doom accordingly in the great day. Alexander beckoned with the hand, desiring to be heard against Paul, for it had been strange if a persecution had been carried on against the Christians and there were not Jews at one end or the other of it. If they could not begin the mischief, they would help it forward, and so make themselves partakers of other men's sins. Some think this Alexander had been a Christian, but had apostatized to Judaism, and therefore was drawn out as a proper person to accuse Paul, and that he was the Alexander the coppersmith that did Paul so much evil, 2 Tim 4:14, and whom he had delivered unto Satan. This occasioned the prosecutors to drop the prosecution of Paul's friends, and to turn it into acclamations in honor of their goddess, v. 34, when they knew that he was a Jew, and, as such, an enemy to the worship of Diana, for the Jews had now an implacable hatred to idols and idolatry. Whatever he had to say for Paul or against him, they were resolved not to hear him, and therefore set the mob a-shouting, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians, whoever runs her down, be he Jew or Christian, we are resolved to cry her up. She is Diana of the Ephesians, our Diana, and it is our honor and happiness to have her temple with us, and she is great, a famous goddess, and universally adored. There are other Dianas, but Diana of the Ephesians is beyond them all, because her temple is more rich and magnificent than any of theirs." This was all the cry for 2 hours together, and it was thought a sufficient confutation of Paul's doctrine, that those are not gods which are made with hands. Thus the most sacred truths are often run down with nothing else but noise and clamor and popular fury. It was said of old concerning idolaters that they were mad upon their idols, and here is an instance of it. Diana made the Ephesians great, for the town was enriched by the vast concourse of people from all parts to Diana's temple there, and therefore they are concerned by all means possible to keep up her sinking reputation with, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." The suppressing and dispersing of these rioters, by the prudence and vigilance of the town clerk, he is called, Grammateus the scribe, or secretary, or recorder, the register of their games, the Olympic games, so others, whose business it was to preserve the names of the victors and the prizes they won. With much ado he, at length, stilled the noise, so as to be heard, and then made a pacific speech to them, and gave us an instance of that of Solomon, "The words of wise men are heard in quiet more than the cry of him that rules among fools," as Demetrius did. Eccle 9:17. He humors them with an acknowledgement that Diana was the celebrated goddess of the Ephesians, v. 35. They needed not to be so loud and strenuous in asserting a truth which nobody denied, or could be ignorant of. Every one knows that the city of the Ephesians is a worshipper of the great goddess Diana, is Neo-Koros, not only that the inhabitants were worshippers of this goddess, but the city, as a corporation, was, by its charter, entrusted with the worship of Diana, to take care of her temple, and to accommodate those who came thither to do her homage. Ephesus is the Adichua, they say that is the most proper word, or the sacrist, of the great goddess Diana. The city was more the patroness and protectress of Diana than Diana was of the city. Such great care did idolaters take for the keeping up of the worship of gods made with hands, while the worship of the true and living God is neglected, and few nations or cities glory in patronizing and protecting that. The temple of Diana at Ephesus was a very rich and sumptuous structure, but, it should seem, the image of Diana in the temple, because they thought it sanctified the temple, was had in greater veneration than the temple, for they persuaded the people that it fell down from Jupiter, and therefore was none of the gods that were made with men's hands. See how easily the credulity of superstitious people is imposed upon by the fraud of designing men. Because this image of Diana had been set up time out of mind, and nobody could tell who made it, they made the people believe it fell down from Jupiter. Now these things, says the town clerk very gravely, but whether seriously or no, and as one that did himself believe them, may be questioned, cannot be spoken against. They have obtained such universal credit that you need not fear contradiction, it can do you no prejudice. Some take it thus, seeing the image of Diana fell down from Jupiter, as we all believe, then what is said against gods made with hands does not at all affect us.